Good evening. It's great to be back at SCI-Arc, where people actually do work. As I can see all around me. Thanks again to the Student Lecture Committee, which this semester especially has done an absolutely incredible job at organizing these lectures. And let me remind you that things will come to a grand finale or some sort of end next week with Raymond Abraham. Sorry, not next week, but the week after that, because next week we'll all be eating turkey. So tonight we have the pleasure of Mike Bell. And the last time I saw Mike Bell was several months ago in Houston. And after tooling around that city in his little Miata, we went up to his apartment, which of course is also his studio and his place of business. And he was busily showing me all of the models of his projects and his fancy computer. And then I noticed that in this high-rise that sits in the middle of Houston, and that's based loosely on James Sterling's Ham Commons building, there was a large window, and then underneath that large window there was a small slot window. And Mike had carefully centered his monk-like bed underneath that tiny little slot window. And if you crouch down and sort of try to imagine what he saw when he woke up in the morning, you would look out through this window and you would see the way that it framed all of Houston into a field, continuous in a good modernist way, collaged together with a utopian dream of crystal towers way off the distance, but shot through with the seedy informality of the automative city peeking up through the trees, including Mike's favorite bar across the street. And what was remarkable to me about that particular view was not so much the city itself, but the way of looking at it, of sleeping with it, if you will, framing it, living it as a simultaneous vertical dislocation and a horizontal extension in which bars and skyscrapers sort of sifted through each other at the same time. Simply, Mike Bell aims to frame modernism in all of its centrifugal and centripetal movement in his architecture. Now, for Mike, it seems to be bred in the bone, or rather into the split level, because he is a good suburban boy, suburban DC to be precise. Having grown up there, he did his undergraduate work at Catholic University, then graduated with a master's degree in architecture from Berkeley and worked with Stanley Sadowitz and Lars Lerup. All sounds pretty normal, except for one dilemma, because here is a convinced believer in the ability of architecture and art to create a moving, unstable context that crystallizes the essential dislocation between sensory reality and mental systems of coherence, who finds himself with teachers and in an urban context that are committed to a continuity in time and space, a vernacular that glosses over, through the means of an architectural and verbal narrative, exactly those disjunctions between the perceived and the conceived. Mike Bell's work, therefore, has been an attempt to reconcile or to investigate Catholicism and agnosticism, Charles Moore and Robert Irwin, Walmart and Picasso. He's done that in such projects as the Amerikanische Gedenkmalbibliothek that he did with Lars Lerup, but more importantly, also with his own work, with his thesis, The House Inside Out, with the Cornell-like peepbox icon of his blue house on the Chesapeake Bay, in his brilliant reflexive desert house, which won him a PA award in 1992, and in a host of other projects that I think we'll be seeing tonight. And not just content to think about these issues in design, he also teaches and writes. And this spring we can expect a book called Slow Space, which he has co-edited, that will bring together a lot of the uncertain ideas about how we make architecture in an uncertain city. So there sits Mike Bell, all the way over in Houston, tinkering away a little bit like the boy in the poster that announced today's lecture, designing, teaching, looking at, and framing what he calls very fast buildings in a very thoughtful way. Please help me to welcome the person who is, I think, well on his way to becoming one of the most important modern architects in America, Mike Bell.
Thank you. That's something. Thank you very much. Actually, the lecture ends with a project that deals with that view out the window, so I'll try to share it with you. I'm going to do something I don't like to do, but I think is necessary. I'm going to actually read a bit of the beginning of the lecture to try and clarify a point of view. If I could have the first two slides, I'd appreciate it. Pablo Picasso once stated that his struggle was to make painting faster than vision. He wanted to get ahead of time so that he could see himself, his own position, more clearly within it. The work I'd like to present tonight is involved in the same sort of struggle, and though I'll try to portray it in as tidy a form and probably a retroactive form as possible, it really occurred as sort of a primal struggle against the constraints of linear time and our convulsive place within it. My work has been about cohering the subject and about architecture's ability to cohere and overcome linear readings of time. The term duration only recently comes to me from Kubler's The Shape of Time, but it has been with me for years. It's used tonight in the Kubler sense of the word, and this is his argument that physical things, inorganic things, occupy time in a different way than biologic beings do. Physical things in Kubler's realm are not subject to chronologic time, they exist in a kind of entropic continuity. The projects I'll present tonight portray two transformations that seek to allow us, or at least me, access to this physical time, this time within things and within space. The first transformation that I'll present tonight is of visuality, a group of projects that seek to transform the accompanying perspectival basin and the accompanying place subject. The struggle of the first projects is to overcome this basin and the subject it posits, that it dominates and situates. It is a struggle to break down form and its visual field with what Rosalind Krauss might call a visual pulse. The term I'll use is syncopation. The term I'll use is syncopation to portray a kind of rocking of perspective out of its basin, the way you might rock a car out of a snow ditch in winter before you can drive free. The goal is to find a kind of open space, a free space for the subject, and eventually to find a way to access matter, things outside of vision's frames, basins, histories, and forms. To do this, the first group of projects I'll show tonight works to transform the vectorial quality of perspective and visuality. These are buildings or ideas about buildings that have sympathy with Picasso's struggle. They are designed to help cohere the subject's place by overcoming standardized ideas of time or sequence, by allowing an access to material duration. Though they work from what I would think of as a very fast visuality, they are ultimately about a sort of slow consciousness of materiality, even though they're models and projects. It would take several lectures to portray the research or thoughts or the research of these thoughts across buildings by Le Corbusier and Mies, and I can't do that tonight. But what I will try to do is briefly at least touch on two foundational architects whose work has really sort of helped in sort of defining some things that I focus on. The first involves De Stijl architecture. The De Stijl Manifesto of 1917, which you can see on your right, was written by Theo van Doesburg, and it states that the new architecture of the De Stijl movement was to be centrifugal in massing, that it would throw its volumes from a center pinion, and that the composition would find its coherence, my word, in a centrifugal arrangement of volumes, now free to find their own shape and proportion, size, and function. The canonical De Stijl projects of Van Doesburg and Van Esteren display this structure, but in other perhaps more complex works, next slide please, And this is a question, such as this project by J.J. Piud. It is not clear. It is clear that a closer inquiry into the nature of centrifugal forces and the correlative, unmentioned by Van Doesburg, centripetal forces is necessary. First of all, in the case of a physical analysis, a centrifugal force, the one mentioned by Van Doesburg, does not exist per se in isolation. It is a reactive force generated in response to a centripetal force. A centripetal force is that which keeps an object in a circular motion. So if you're spinning a lasso, the rope actually represents the centripetal force. A centrifugal force is generated actually by the object itself, and it's the tendency of the object to move in a straight line based on its own inertia. In a colloquial format, physicists portray a centripetal force as center-seeking, and a centrifugal force is termed as center-fleeing, trying to escape. Van Doesburg only mentions a centrifugal force, but in the case of buildings such as this one by Oud, it seems the architect is fully cognizant of a centripetal force as well. In the case of Oud's project, the massing is organized about a centralized cruciform format. The building is composed of brick, but the building's walls are actually quite thin and developed in a planar configuration that sets up the possibility of reading the building as more of a membrane structure than one would expect. It is not difficult to imagine that the building is conceived of as an expansive solid that is subsequently hollowed out till its edges are hewed to a somewhat delicate thinness, that the architect is seeking the edge in a probing-like manner, excavating towards an apparent outer edge, unmentioned by Van Doesburg. Other complexities occur. Next two slides. Other complexities occur in the stair that works its way up through the center of the building. The topology of the stair instigates a play in which the predominance of edge versus center is forced into a migrating correlation. In the end, it is not clear which has achieved dominance. Is the building centripetal or centrifugal? The stair in Oud's building is situated between two load-bearing columns. The center is hollowed out, and the stair actually casts itself back forward to the second level where it moves out towards the edge. In the end, is the building centrifugal or centripetal? And this is not a complete lecture on Steel per se, but I would suspect, and the reading of this work that has enabled me to sort of formulate my own positions, has been that actually it seeks a balance. It seeks a position that is neither expansive nor contractive, a position in which matter seems to be posited by form, yet not dominated by it. A question is in place then: how can form cohere matter in a way that allows matter to be read in Kubler's sense of duration? How can it be removed from the hegemony of the eye and the dominance of language? And how is the subject in such a sort of spatial situation posited? Next two slides, please. The works that I'd briefly like to look at that help deal with these questions, or at least help me form these positions a number of years ago, really, is taken a stride for a minute into looking at the work of Giuseppe Torrani. Next two slides. The first position has to do with windows and walls. In Torrani's work, you can find work on windows as a device that arbitrates depth, but also as a device that sets up torsions and forces in a coplanar fashion across a windows and wall surface. The same arguments occur, periphery versus edge and center, that de Stijl applied to form, here are applied to visuality in a way that unhinged form and matter from vision. Consider these projects by Torrani. The Casa Rustici, seen on the left, the play of center versus edge sets up a position where the eye is denied its apparent dominance over form. The periphery allows the eye to temporarily hold on to the building form in a sort of stuttering-like fashion, but the center provides a vacated abyss, a convulsive space, a vacuum really. How can the eye hold such a space? And in doing so, or in trying to do so, what is the result of its ability to cohere the form that it isn't able to focus on? Even when working with normal windows, Torrani dilates the oculus to a point of ambiguous proportion or control. The eye falls into Torrani's windows, but depth is not modulated, and the eye ultimately fails, presumably itself over-dilated at this point. This building has been very formative for me, and in a seminar format, I would spend weeks looking at this project. But tonight, I would just at least try to want to understand this situation of setting up a peripheral reading for the eye, even though it's punctured by windows, etc. And then the sort of the center, the consequence of voiding the center and the ability of the eye to sort of cohere these two places. Next two slides. The question then for me tonight is will fall in two phases, and I'd like to look at two periods of work. The one deals with visuality and the use of Picasso's idea about speed and Krauss's pulse to break down form and reveal duration of material. Part two, the more recent work, will deal with an idea of torsion and gravity as a vectorial force and manipulating that vector in an attempt to get at some ideas about material in the building. Both of the positions I'll try to present tonight in my work, and it's not as tidy as I would like it to appear, I suppose, really are used to cohere the subject's place, the subject's situation, in the milieu of contemporary practice, whether the city, the sprawl, the suburb, and finally in the project I'll end with, the kind of entropic city of Center Houston. I'm looking, the two photos portray, on one hand, two ideas about a vectorial transformation. On the left, the flow of water actually finding something that it needs to resist and buckling and rearranging itself to do so. But more interestingly, more interestingly in the case on the right, a bullet at this point smashing through a plexiglass plate, continuing its trajectory, but in its trace, leaving a kind of vaporous membrane that that begins to sort of modulate the reading of the form and begins to kind of move, not in a dihedral fashion to the plate, but along the plate. Next two slides. What I'm interested in really is finding a way to create a sort of more haptic visuality. The water eventually seems to me more interesting in its sort of convulsive active state, and in another situation in fluid dynamics where water has to find a new sort of condition after dealing with a breakdown as it searches for its new configurations. Next slide. In the end, as speaking in the Kubler sense of the word, I like the projects will move towards a sort of look at material, and though not in a complete sense, actually the thoughts as I move through the projects move towards beginning to try to think of material, not so much in a formal sense or how it's shaped, but in a sort of sense of how it actually is internally activated and what's the geometry of it in an internal figuration. Next slide. Next slide. The first projects, and this is a bit of a history for me, even though they're only a few years old, it takes a bit of sort of recouping to get back to them. I present them because I think it's necessary to understand the later work. The early work fell under a rubric that I worked with, and at this point it's almost embarrassing to speak of, but the title was Space Inside Out. And the title came from a situation where it was perceived that that bullet moving through the plexiglass, that the force it left behind in a coplanar fashion along the surface of glass might cause fluctuations in form or fluctuations in space that could sort of ultimately conceive of actually turning the volume or space of a building inside out. The question for me was, what is the place of a subject in an inside-out space, and what is the nature of material in an inside-out space? Next. The project that was sort of capped to this sort of couple of years of investigation was a house designed for an art collector in the Santa Fe desert. Is a doctor and a painter and an art collector based in San Francisco, purchased 4 acres of property on a knoll in actually Galisteo, about 7 miles from the town square in Santa Fe. He is full of sort of doubts about whether or not you should build on this site, whether you should build in the desert at all. Also full of doubts about what was happening to Santa Fe, but proceeded nonetheless, and we tried to sort of reconcile our ideas about that. The house actually consisted of 2 volumes. A house normally consisting of 1, I would suppose, this one 2, and not connected by any physical means. Both of them in their center had a cruciform-shaped art gallery, this one being only an art gallery with a library and a reading room, this being a study above, and a kitchen and a dining room, and a bedroom and another gallery. The approach brings you along the top of the knoll, around the composition of the houses where you would abandon the car and begin an axial approach through the 2 buildings. Next slide. The project is set up in a situation in various ways that was interested in trying to unframe the notion of a perspectival basin. It was fully cognizant, though, in a sort of overly pedagogical way of actually trying to structure that pedagogical basin in a way that you might actually structure it and then overcome it. The building on the left is a gallery, the other gallery, the kitchen and dining room, and the bedroom again, and the approach, which would set up a viewpoint right through the 2 buildings, seen in axonometric here and here. There is virtually no sort of point of cover in this house. Any corner you turn around, you would be entirely exposed to the other building or to the desert. If we could have the next 2 slides, that would. This is two views of how the buildings relate to each other, but again, these are not views of how it actually would be experienced. The cruciform is identical in both buildings. In one building, it actually takes on this plate construction from above and a plate construction from below that starts to reframe the cruciform and create a peripheral space around it. In the other building, there is no peripheral space, and actually the desert sort of comes right up to the building. The primary building is situated in a recessed field. Next two slides. The building for me really was designed to come alive at eye level and during inhabitation. And though it actually was attempting to actually tell the subject where to stand, it was ultimately concerned with actually trying to let the feet rest, but set up a situation where the dominance of the perspective would ultimately fail. The device that I retroactively began to understand it as that I employed was I would call syncopation, and that the deep center space, as the reading of the Tarani building sort of notated, was open and vacated. A sort of marginal periphery space was clearly demarcated with an overtly painted black frame, while another peripheral space, this one being the entry, this one being a wall in the kitchen, sets up of another sort of peripheral reading. The idea was to actually set up a position where the eye was looking for a point to rest, but was sort of induced to look deeper into the central space in a way that ultimately it wouldn't be able to hold either form in its sort of consideration. Again, with the bullet Mach cone idea, the idea was that visuality as a vector would have a sort of speed that might ultimately threaten the stability, the geometric or Cartesian stability of the form. Next two slides. View from either side of the building. In that wake, I found myself very interested in what would be left. Certainly what would be left is us, the human body, and at that point I really began to think of the body as a sort of figure ground thickness that would refuse to relent to any kind of virtual physics such as this. But also what's left is these benches which were to be concrete, solid concrete impregnated with color, that will also refuse to sort of dissipate given this kind of virtual physics as well. The shell of the building, in a sense, is set up in a pedagogic way, a geometric way, a strong way, but was seen to be threatened by the kind of visual field that was operating through it. Next two slides. The building worked in all directions, and I was very interested in the idea that there would never particularly be any relief from this sort of composition. For me, the goal really had something to do with the idea of security and the idea of dwelling in the desert, that you wouldn't particularly be giving yourself walls to hide behind or situations that would give you cover, but instead that you would actually, even in a house, begin to understand what it would be like to be out on that plane. In the center gallery then, the Oculus opens into a peripheral space where various functions can occur, but that immediately gives way across into the plaza to a tower above and a study that would be above. Standing under the Oculus of the tower above, the space continues out above you and drops down in front of you in a way like your own hand might be in front of your face, and you would say, that's me over there. What am I doing over there? Next two slides. The Oculus works like this. There's a sort of interest in the same situation of trying to get the syncopation to work in various formats. The view from this position to this position would set one up to look through the outer frame of the building and then to the inner frame of the building. I was trying to work at an idea that in this kind of spatial reading there would be neither a simple figure ground reading or a simple inside or outside, but that you would in a sense be standing inside the inside or outside the outside, or maybe you would be inside and feel like you were outside. Next two slides. Looking through the house from inside the main gallery towards the stair up into the tower, which is actually completed above your head, and that space where you would look down back into the gallery or look across into the stair that takes you up into the gallery. Next slide. At the time, I was reading an essay called Mimicry and Legendary Psychasthenia by Roger Koelwa. And Koelwa at the end of his essay comes to a term called psychasthenia, which he uses to describe a personality that is having trouble distinguishing itself from space. Koelwa's portrayal of a successfully formed personality has to do with the idea that you can tell where your distinctions end and where space begins, that you know how to fundamentally cohere yourself in a spatial realm. When those sort of conditions are threatened, Koelwa talks about what occurs. At the extreme end of it, schizophrenia occurs, but the other end of it is the potential for a sublime reading of space in which you begin to know what your body is and what it's not. The quote, I think, is pretty clear at this point. Collage elevations depicting some sort of, using Moholy-Nagy photographs, depicting some sort of nebulous figure ground quality of the body that refuses to go away, but at the same time is sort of seeking a new sort of reading, whether it's positive or a negative reading in such a space. It's not quite sure at this point. Next 2 slides. That equation of being inside the inside in this collage was portrayed by using reflective glass from Philip Johnson's glass house. One hand actually sort of seeing through the glass, or also seeing that which the glass is reflecting in front of it, versus seeing deeper into that inside space, and another solarized image from Moholy-Nagy. Next 2 slides. I found myself very interested in the idea of actually dilating and opening to the point where it was not, you were not sure anymore if it was an aperture, or if it was a room, or if it was so big that it actually was something that was more convulsive than either. In any case, the idea was to sort of push the idea of a window till the window became bigger than the room, even though in this case it's not quite physically possible, but to the point where the space becomes, in a way, engulfing, convulsive, necessary to deal with. Next 2 slides. The project was based in various sort of realms of other research and ideas. At the top is a quote from Robert Slutsky talking about Le Corbusier's thickening of space with the brise-soleil. In this case, I wondered if the space would be thin after such a sort of vectorial transformation. Rosalind Krauss, in an analysis of a photograph by Man Ray, talks about the body, or at least it talks about a composition in which the frame and the figure have a reciprocal relationship to the point where you're not sure if the frame is shoring up the body or the body is shoring up the frame. In the de Stijl argument, in the Oud building, the argument has to do with, is the building expansive or is the building contractive? And if one could find a sort of balance between the two, might that be the place where matter is not particularly dominated by form, but starts to have its own sort of activity? Next 2 slides. Next 2 slides. To give just a brief background on how these works emerged, at that point I felt with the Lyman House that the idea was somewhat fully formed. I felt the need to try to move on. But to give a background of some of the struggle to actually get to a point and some work on this idea of a dilated oculus, I'll show a little bit of background on it. It was actually before, I think it was 1989, that a group of us, led by Lars Larup, were asked to submit a project to Berlin, the city of Berlin, in a project that, I think it was the year that Berlin was the cultural city of Europe. We decided as a group to work inside what was then the Berlin Wall, an area that was called No Man's Land, which was conceived of as a sort of belted space around the city of Berlin, mined 100 meters wide with a wall on either side, actually, and drastically different worlds on either side. Next 2 slides. In that zone, and with these rather happy-looking drawings, we decided that we would develop a sort of zone that would be belong to neither East nor West Germany. My contribution to the project was called the Stoa, and it had to do with sort of providing a place for political debate or ideas. The reading for the Stoa actually fit very clearly into what I was working on, in that we just, through various readings, we started to understand this belt of space around Berlin as a courtyard, but an inside-out courtyard, or courtyard that had somehow been topologically inverted. It set itself up for a study of, it began, that reading is the reading that actually sort of made me sort of realize that I could move on and look at mathematics a bit to understand that perhaps these configurations of space could be thought of more clearly topologically. Obvious topological forms such as a Mobius strip come to mind, but others such as the Hoffman Janus 2 are a bit more complex. Next slide. The Oculus, again, predominated, still in the format of, at least this prior to the Lyman House, in the format of being the size of a room, but dealing with a few things in this case and not as fully formed. But the center, the idea of frontality is still in place. The idea of a subject that stands in front of the building is still in place, but various ways in which the Oculus moves forward or moves in a recessive, sort of convulsive way backwards is situated. The promenade through this building moves across, and this is only half a model, moves across a plateau in which you open to the front, open to the back, open to the front, open to the back. And if I could have the next slide. In section is open vertically in a sort of 3D intermesh of voids that sort of, in one hand, is constantly opening again. It's sort of, the building ultimately has no figure ground except for the density of its own walls. And this is the plan that takes you through the building, and these 3D voids move up and down through it. Next slides. And you can see these spaces here. The frontal plate doesn't particularly give clues as to what's available. It deals with the deep space of the Oculus, but at the same time, incisions in that frontal plate were thought of as a very beginning, and this is where the projects that I'll end with tonight lead, in starting to deal with the idea of torsions along a surface rather than perpendicular to it. Next slide. The project that preceded this one, and this is the end of thinking about the Oculus situation, was a house designed for St. Mary's County. It's situated on a riverfront site in a 16th, 17th century Catholic region of Maryland. Vernacular arguments figured predominantly in the idea here, and that I was wondering if I could apply some of these spatial concepts and still take in things that belong to the region. Things that belong to the region in this case were twin chimneys, twin towers, twin all sorts of things in the rather totemic devices in the region, but also something that was called Chinese Chippendale, a sort of wood carving that was developed in the region by various sort of craftsmen. Other aspects, the cruciform, usually in plan, though sometimes even in elevation, figured. But again, the Oculus and the idea of a shallow sort of space that eventually siphoned itself off through a center figured in the front and the back of the building, and ultimately sort of dominated the topological reading of the building. Next slide. The perspective drawing, not particularly a fancy drawing, but somewhat powerful in the sense that at least it put the vanishing point in the Oculus in a way that I was trying to induce that sort of reading, and this is a sort of telescopic assemblage of how the Oculus works. Next slide. The building is quite simple in many ways. The buildings in the region, houses in the region, usually had a kitchen that was separate from the main space. They had stairs that would go up the corner of the space, which were sort of known as wasting the space, but yet it was still a sort of common concern. They usually had separate outbuildings, and they often had various things such as widow walks, which in this case come down and turn into the bedroom on the second level. But topologically, the building was sort of working in a way that the building was moving around in a way that the form was sort of coming through itself and around and back around and out of itself. I was working with metaphors at the time of the way the surface of the face turns into the inner surface of the mouth, turns into the surface of the trachea, into the lungs, and then back out again. And frankly, these were almost thought of as lungs and interiors of lungs that would come back out. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Now, if I could take a segue here, a building by John Haydock can help me move on to the work that I'm currently doing, and I think has roots in a far different situation. I'm moving to Houston, as Aaron noted. It's not particularly unlike LA. It's an absolute megalopolis and a sprawl city. But other issues have come up as well. In Mask of Medusa and in various other formats, it seems I've heard John Haydock often talk about how he moved from the from the Diamond House, which this is a model by a student of mine, Diamond House C, to the Bi House. And in describing this sort of translation, Haydock talks about having become fascinated by the hypotenuse of the diamond projects. Now, the general thesis of the diamond projects, in a nutshell, at least had to do with the notion of the rotated frame and the various sort of centrifugal and centripetal energies developed from the frame versus the center of the composition. In the case of the Diamond House C, Haydock talks about having become obsessed with this hypotenuse and interested in the idea of stretching the hypotenuse. He talks about sort of actually tugging at the corners and testing the limits of its strength. At one point, he talks about that he realized that if he actually tugged quickly, very quickly, that he could snap the frame of the building into a plane, that it would collapse into a line, and that if he did it quickly enough, or conceived of it quickly enough, that all else would stay in place. So the plastic contours, which in this composition have a sort of centrifugal, centripetal, heavily plastic quality, or maybe they don't actually in the center, in a way could start to be understood as the contours of the Bi House, which follows it. And the frame actually can start to be understood as the wall that composes the composition. Now, and Haydock talks about the Bi House, he talks about the wall as actually becoming time. When he talks about how to color the Bi House, he talks about finding muted, saturated primaries that would be absorptive, but yet also a bit reflective. The wall, he says, is the neutral condition, and that in the drawing, which in my mind has so many clues about what might be on John Haydock's mind in this case, in that he draws this sort of chiaroscuro around the forms but seems to be sort of meditating more on the nature of the configuration of the space around the building, and the building in a way ends up being that which is undrawn, even though it is rendered in places. For me, the building actually does, and Hayek talks about this sort of thing in his poetry, actually achieves, I think, this notion of turning space inside out. The question for me that I think the Bauhaus really becomes a meditation on and can lead into the next work that I'll try to present is that what is the nature of density of materials in the Kubler sense of duration, material existing outside of standard chronologic time, existing instead in a sort of metabolic atomic time. Hayek didn't build this project, but he did, and it's not particularly conceived of in materials, even though it went through working drawings and materials were assigned. But the arguments that support it usually have to do with color, and dealing with color in a way that might set up a form that seemed to be present, but not particularly expansive or contractive. Next 2 slides. What I'd like to look at in the next group of projects is a notion of looking at walls and the torsions and surface and energies that can develop in the walls. For me, the idea of the dihedral house, the idea of the blue house, the idea of the stoa, the fact that they posited a subject and told that subject where to stand, even though they were interested in sort of ultimately sort of destroying a perspectival basin and the dominance it holds over form and visuality, it seemed I wondered if it would be possible to conceive of a building without a station point. The situation then went from a dihedral topology to a sort of coplanar topology, thinking about torsion along surfaces, thinking about walls as surfaces, windows as surfaces, rather than as depth. Next 2 slides. Tarani actually still helps here. And the interesting thing about Tarani is that his work seems to move through so many realms this way. But just to take him slightly out of context and not really make any conclusive argument, I find myself, having completed that work, having become very interested in the coplanar quality of the glass. Not the glass as something that arranges depth from one side to the other, but as something that actually was just attempting to be the same surface as the wall that it was involved in. Next 2 slides. Looking at the projects such as the Novacomb by Tarani, this sort of reading for me made the building available in ways that it hadn't been before. The expanse of the openings, again oculuses, but again seeming to be dilated to a point where they're a little bit too large, maybe a little bit too many of them, to the extent that they seem to actually create a wall that reads as a somewhat delicate membrane, a wall that is probably pushed a little bit too far to retain its strength. To maintain its strength, my reading of the building, and at least the reading that I use to move forward in my own work, has to do with the idea that the building actually might be conceived as a sort of structural box beam, that the floors, the walls, and the ceilings all act together to sort of create a unit construction that has strength across its surfaces, that the windows, and in this case a sliding window above, are actually more conceived of as diaphragms than as arrangers or arbitrators of depth, standard pictorial depth. It seems that the size of them is set up in a way that they're a little bit too big to be any sort of tidy sort of arranger of depth, that they're a little bit too big that the eye still can't quite hold on to their scope. Next slide. In that case, then, the argument for me has to do with torsion and the idea that that one might start to conceive of a form as actually sort of too preoccupied with its own structural problems to even be interested in positing a subject, but a certain specific type of torsion, not torsion sort of taken care of in a structural strut such as this one, but shear torsion. This being a diagram from a company called Algor, who does finite element analysis software, in which it portrays a plate under pure shear rather than any sort of dihedral stress, at which point does a plate actually start to fail from being loaded only in its own plane. Next slide. Tarani, in a building that, for the life of me, I can't figure out why it hasn't been talked about more, and I actually have been trying to learn more about it, but I'm hesitant to know anything conclusive at this point. But Tarani actually, in a project, a viewing stand from Mussolini, actually went through the exercise of doing photoelastic studies of the development of stresses and strains across the wall surfaces. In the end, those stresses and strains actually got mapped into the composition of the coursing. Next 2 slides. For me, where this is leading, and in a seminar I'm doing at Rice right now, is we're starting to work with structural engineers and the mechanical engineers in an attempt to start to think of materials as, on one hand, being posited and looked at and read in terms of visuality, but conceived and thought of, and to a physicist this would probably be the obvious thing to do, in terms of atomic construction, thinking actually more about the most primary ways in which a material gains strength, rather than the sort of formulaic ways, at least that I learned statics and strength of materials as an undergraduate. In this case, this is a look, actually a plan view, you might call it, of carbon atoms lining themselves up in vertical columns in a piece of steel, and the way in which strength dissipates around those actual atomic structures. Next slide. Now, I wouldn't argue that I've actually taken this on in the work, that I'm only beginning to think about this. And it's probably asking quite a bit to think about it. The first project that tries to deal with this, actually maybe the second or third, is a daycare center outside of Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C., right on the edge of a planned community called Columbia, Maryland, but a little bit too far on the edge of it, where the planning no longer holds. The client has a daycare center with 100 children, and she was interested in the fact that daycare centers, she thought, could be reconsidered in light of how predominant they are in today's culture. She wondered if there was a way actually to sort of help children understand more about their position within the whole situation. My reading of it has to do with the fact that this building was to be situated as a prototype at the back of 42 acres of rather standard commercial developments, grocery stores, ultimately be car dealerships back here. And this piece of property actually was pretty much held back from development because it's a watershed. Next slide. The building works in a couple ways in that I was interested in, at this point, trying to think about gravity, and gravity in a vector formation, but thwarting it in a similar way that I was interested in thwarting perspective. The building works as a box beam. As developed and such, it sort of actually helps me understand the Novacomb in retrospect, but works with a sort of situation in which centers of gravity and centers of mass are a little bit difficult. And for me, the intriguing diagram here is the ring in which a center of mass and gravity would fall outside of the material, so that any sort of traditional gravitational vector reading of such a situation would actually put a vector tugging on a void space. For me in the building, then, the idea was similar to that, the work with the perspective projects, in that I was interested in setting up gravity to sort of work on the void spaces, on the empty spaces, and wonder what that might do to activate gravity across the surfaces. The sort of speculation that I had was that the surfaces of a building that was operating as a box beam, the wall, the ceiling, or at least the roof plate, the floor plate, the wall plates, would all start to actually develop torsions in a sort of complex manner across their surface that would operate more like field torsions rather than vector torsions. Next slide. The project is a sort of searching project, and this is Los Angeles, so people maybe don't find it shocking or something, but I think it's a bit silly in some ways. But it actually worked with the idea that the surface of the building, and that sounded funny, I'm sorry. I just meant this is where very outrageous architecture often happens. I was in San Francisco and it didn't. The project works with the idea that there would be a steel plate that moves across the surface, and it was set up in a way that it would actually hopefully be as thin as an inch or an inch and a half thick, and that the floors would be concrete plates that would work in concordance with them. I was interested in the idea of actually pushing the concrete plates in the floor to be a sort of thinness where they wouldn't actually start to want to fail on their own, but given the fact that they're worked in a box configuration, that they might hold together. Next slide. Upstairs was a kindergarten, downstairs was the daycare center. Next slide. You can go through these sort of until we reach the end of this project. The reading for me had to do with an idea that the traditional notion of a perspective or a position subject wouldn't really help us understand our position in a sort of situation such as this, building behind car dealerships and supermarkets, but that any attempt to sort of find a way, Picasso's struggle, to know how to position yourself in that sort of unsituated time would have to deal with a new way of making time. For me, the idea, and as naive as it might sound, was to wonder, we'll stop there please, if it would be possible to make a building that might serve in some sort of format, even for children, as the beginning way of starting to possibly formulate other ways of imagining how buildings work, how time works in them, how buildings work in making time in cities. The project had a couple antecedents. One of them was a small guest house, which also, as with most of these, are not built, none of these, that worked with this notion of setting up surfaces as the structural component of a building. A small slab for a floor and a ceiling actually is kept virtually open in this situation by using glass and a steel box column system along the periphery of a building. It was to be pinned just below the top surface of the building and just above the bottom surface in a way that would sort of make the glass, in a way, belong to the space outside rather than to the room. Next slide. A view of the inside gives some sort of sense of how the glass you might sort of reach for the surface rather than feeling enclosed by it. Next slide. In a just small segue, another project the project that preceded that was really a study for that project, didn't get as far, but it was ultimately conserved in a very basic idea of just using wood frame and dealing with surface in a way that would be laid upon or applied to in a way that you might think the surface belonged to the courtyard rather than the building. Next slide. Now this brings me to the view that Aaron spoke of, and to Houston, where I think in a way it's not possible to think of architecture in maybe such hermetic terms any longer. Working at Berkeley, where there isn't such a preoccupation with the city or with urbanism, the Bay Area is generally considered to work pretty well, although it's too crowded. But the language up there really didn't worry too much about the real nature of the city. I moved to Houston a year ago to teach at Rice, and this Houston it hits you quite strongly. You can anticipate it, and for those of you who live in Los Angeles, I'm sure you would have a much easier time anticipating it. It's actually quite a bit smaller than Los Angeles, but it's unbelievably chaotic, unbelievably sort of fragmented and broken up, but at the same time fantastically compelling, and actually not particularly as distressing as it could look. The center of Houston is a very interesting place, and that this is what occurs on Houston postcards, and this is what occurs out my window. But that actually, that downtown is virtually vacated in the evenings. As with any number of urban downtowns, it's really a corporate office park to the extent that, as far as I understand, the landowners actually own half of the street in front of their buildings. That the street really isn't even owned by the city. The downtown is vacated at night. But what's very interesting about the downtown is that it's belted in by an area that's known in a sort of casual sense these days as Midtown. And Midtown extends from downtown across an area called Montrose and towards the museum districts where will soon be a new Rafael Moneo building, Beats van der Rohe building, and Rice University. So it's actually quite an interesting area that never developed as fully as it was supposed to. Downtown was once centrifugal. It was growing outwards. But in the mid-'80s, with the total collapse of the oil business, downtown stopped growing faster, I think, than probably any city in the country. In the next few slides, we'll get a look at actually what happens around that downtown. Next slide. This is a view of looking in a sort of proud way at downtown growing over the years. And this is a view of downtown on its way to growing, not fully filled out yet. The city has a grid, although a large grid, but it's full of holes and never particularly completed. I think there was a time when they really believed they were going to fill the entire place up like this, but it retreated, and when the money collapsed, the city collapsed as well. Next slide. So a view within this region called Midtown, on one hand, is a bit forlorn and derelict, but on another hand, because it's in the south and because it's in this virtual jungle of a climate, actually has a sort of growth to it that's fascinating. There is no particular urban fabric. A group of students and I recently walked 8 miles across the city to try and wonder actually what it felt like to walk across the city, because the only thing anyone does is drive. And we realized that was a cliche to worry about that, but in walking across it, it was unbelievable sort of how brutal the city was. I mean, the sidewalks are entirely broken, there's bugs, there's incredible sort of pollution. It's a mess, but at the same time, there's a sort of vegetation that's relentless, and even some very interesting buildings that pop up. Next slide. This is no more than 4 or 5 blocks from a 48-story tower. And it sits on a piece of land that would have been, had the growth continued, more 48-story towers. In the south, the vegetation is relentless. The trees are quite beautiful in some cases. At least these aren't so beautiful, but others are. But you get this kind of holes in the city, fields that in a way, all of a sudden the vegetation seems like it might be the same as it was 500 years ago, despite the fact that there's current building right next to it. Next slide. Downtown has some basic structural problems to it, I would suppose, in terms of planning. What is conceived of as the downtown is virtually belted in by a congregation of freeways. The interesting part of Midtown that we were just looking at occurs just past this freeway, which is Highway 45, which will take you down to the Gulf of Mexico in about 30 minutes. Midtown runs through this area on the way to Rice University, up Large Park, a couple museums are here. Where the development went in the 80s, when it did finally come back, and it started well before the 80s, is it sort of leapfrogged across the city to an area out here called the Galleria, which now has this sort of Oz-like splendor to it, this sort of unbelievable scale and amount of glitz and money that's out there. It is an absolutely successful financial area. Downtown is essentially an oil company office park, although it appears to be a city. This is the area that we have been working a lot on at Rice, and the area that I actually find interesting in a very fundamental way, in that while many today are fascinated by and are working in a very compelling way on absolutely mega growth cities, whether in Asia or Mexico or anywhere else that sort of is experiencing new major capitalistic growth. There are also cities such as this one, which I think are just as compelling and just as difficult to know what to do with, in that when the money left, and it isn't particularly coming back, although it's coming back somewhat, and when there doesn't appear to be enough legislation or even enough will to kind of rebuild this city in a way that it might have been conceived of or they thought it should have been conceived of. The question for me is, what do we do with these cities, and how do we conceive of them, and how do you work within such a city? Next slide. Houston is not going to go away. It's resurging in various ways. Compact computers is there. Any number of new sort of companies have emerged when the city decided to diversify from oil. But one of the fundamental reasons Houston is going to be intact for quite a while is something that people you don't hear as much discussion about these days, but it's some fundamental hardware such as the oil pipelines that actually still are mostly based in Houston and go all the way up into Chicago and Detroit and up into Massachusetts. The oil pipelines are there, and as long as the oil pipelines are there and needed, there is one sort of economic base that's going to be there, although there's a general fear that will never particularly come back to the strength that it had, that it might have filled out the city in some larger way that they planned. Next slide. One thing about Houston, or leaving California, is how much in stride Houston takes sort of catastrophic pollution problems. When we had floods in Houston 3 weeks ago, unbelievable, a number of houses were just washed underwater. And as if that wasn't bad enough, and these houses were knowingly built on floodplains, oil pipelines and gasoline pipelines broke under the river and started fires on the river. For 12 miles long, there was a fire that came along and burnt the tops off of the houses that weren't fully submerged. This was a story for about a day and a half. In San Francisco about 2 years ago, I remember some asbestos being spilled on the Golden Gate Bridge and the entire bridge being closed down for the day. The way Houston takes these sort of things at its stride is either some real testament to its youth, which I think is what it is, and it's actually quite exciting that way. I mean, but sort of it's insane as well. The other situation that you'll find is that sort of growth that might have happened in the downtown that was abated and was abandoned has now moved to the periphery of Houston. And outside of Houston, if you go 5 miles out, you'll find building going on like crazy. And you'll even find a press and a populace that's pretty excited about getting a new strip mall or a department store. The sense that there isn't particularly any urbanism on the edge of Houston is not only clear, but it's not particularly even seems to be worried about that much. Next slide. What I'd like to do, though, is return to this sort of core, because it's an incredibly interesting area. And on a walking tour through that area, you'll find actually that it's been, and I think like LA, it's actually been quite a laboratory for some interesting and ambitious building. In this situation, there's just two cases, a sort of Wrightian Winslow house knockoff maybe, but a lot of buildings like this done with some care. A bit dilapidated, but still done with some care. And this one, actually a very beautifully refined, I think, masonry structure that for me recalls some of the issues that I was looking at in the Oud building. Next slide. There's also the relentless nature, which Houston is known for its trees. These are some ambitious ones. It also, even in a dilapidated sense, has some pleasant sidewalks moving through this area. Next slides. The surface, which is I think what keeps most of the wealthier aspects of Houston from being too interested in doing something about this area, is polluted, but it's really on the surface and is nothing like the idea of a river on fire. Also, there is a sort of, again, this kind of relentless nature, which if you get down into a place like Houston, you find people often talking about the sort of relentlessness which with nature keeps coming back. Fire ants, in this case, which I'm told ball themselves up and float across floods and get to you if they want to. Next slides. They don't sink. What I chose to do in this case to try to think through what I would do in a situation like this is I took a site actually in this area and decided I would develop a prototypical live-work housing for this area. There are big plans, although there isn't money or legislation, to try to get people to move back into this area and to try to find a way for people to occupy it again. Next slide. There's two trays. Coming from San Francisco, this was really kind of an adventure to explore a city like this. The site then is on a one-way street. It's the last exit from the freeway, and it's really a road that drops you right into downtown. It's called Louisiana Street, and traffic runs this way towards downtown, and looking the other way takes you right to downtown. That's much closer than that lens suggests. But again, this sort of strange dichotomy in Houston, in that the land is not as expensive as it looks, and that actually small buildings like this car garage can control and have enough cash flow to hold a whole lot to themselves, probably with parking for 30 cars. There's no parking meters in Houston. It's in the sense that sort of holy landscape that I was portraying then is startling in ways across the whole city, in that the land is not particularly maximized or built out to its full envelope, and at least at this point in the economic game, doesn't have to be. Next slides. What I decided to do then was to take this area in a way that deals somewhat with the people that are there. There is a kind of typical, some pseudo-gentrification going on, but I wouldn't particularly want to endorse that or support that in any typical way. But there is an interest in people trying to make this a more livable place than it's been. And in that case, what I decided to do was to try and develop not so much a live-work building or even a house, but what I thought an urban building in this place might be. I ended up developing a house that had 3 courtyards and 3 buildings, and even tried to deal with sort of the situation of the land that would be left over in a way that land is left over in this region, to try to understand something of the space in that region. Next 2 slides. The project is actually quite small. The lot is not actually very big either. The building probably encloses about 1,400 square feet in 1 volume, 2 volumes, and 3 volumes. There's a courtyard in the front at the street. There's a courtyard behind one of the houses, and there's a courtyard between 2 of the spaces. One of the spaces was conceived of as a sort of arboretum that would collect up that nature and start to actually allow somebody to work with it more carefully. On the street, there's a curtain wall, the backside of a curtain wall, really. This is the same curtain wall that runs along this space, turns itself and comes around to the point where this is behind the curtain wall and the street ends up behind the curtain wall. They both end up being insides of a sort looking into this courtyard. But the curtain walls move in a sort of serial fashion, developing themselves in some sort of standard fashion, 1, 2, 3, 4, running along until they change a vector and set themselves up to sort of turn around and attempt to reconfigure other spaces, such as this space or that space. The building, all of the spaces are quite narrow. They're all virtually equal. The inside spaces are virtually equal to the outside spaces, and the walls are conceived of in two fashions. One in which there's a concrete tilt-up construction system, the other the glazed curtain wall system, and that they all exist in kind of brittle formation, meeting in kind of precarious point-to-point situations here or there, the glazing laid upon the surface but not particularly attached to it or belonging to it, set up in a way that the readings of inside or outside might fluctuate. The walls might actually be seen as sort of sustaining a geometry, but not particularly holding on to it in as rigorous a fashion as they might like to. The building, for me, was moving on in a finally, I think, a more serious fashion and trying to think about this notion of torsion along surfaces. And the particular interest in this case moved to not so much Philip Johnson or Mies, although it obviously looks like that, but into an interest actually in tempered glass and the idea of this sort of strength that would be along the surface of the glass. The framing is steel. This is the entry. This is another entry. There's an entry into this building here, entries here, here, and over here. But the interest was really in this kind of iron framing and a plate glass that would have a kind of resonance and a wobble to it almost when you got involved with operating it. Next slides. These are images I think are pretty descriptive, so I won't sort of labor them too much. The final piece of glass at the top is unframed on its upper edge and is situated in a way not unlike air conditioning equipment on buildings in these sort of cities. You don't particularly know quite why it's situated there, but in the study model, I hope I have a photo anyway, that portrays how it works in standing in either this sort of space in the back or on this space in the street. It becomes a kind of piece of glass that I thought of as sort of as unframed as it could possibly be, to become this almost not there piece of sheer surface, sort of modulating between you and things. Next slide. The driveway, very typical driveway. Car would be left behind. You could either enter into the building this way, or you might come along into the glass vestibule and enter across the courtyard and into the space. Next slide. These slides are just rotating around the building. Some of the entries are not cut through walls, such as this one, which is a notch out. Others actually cut through the entire wall. And a door is conceived of and detailed in some finer drawings I have in a way that the metal would actually sort of touch the plate of... Oops, I've broken this just as I was warned I would. Sorry. You know how to fix this thing? It was bound to happen, I was warned. The steel door frame is detailed in a way that it would sort of hit the top ledge of the roof and the side ledges of the wall. Next slide. Next. Thank you. The roof over the arboretum is an altered section of the same glass that occurs on all the horizontal surfaces. Next slide. This is looking through the back. If we had taken the time and we didn't get to, we could have collaged Houston in, and you would see the arrangement of Houston through that plate. The software is 3D Studio, where it's actually pretty easy to do things like that. Next slide. Next slide. This is a view upon the entry into that courtyard, and this is a view from having left the car. There are two kitchens in the building. It's really sort of a nomad space in which you might choose to live in any number of the spaces. The equalization of the courtyards versus the interiors, they're equal, but they're still distinct enough. They operate in a general sort of fashion that it's a shallow space that you look out from or that might arrange you. But to me, there's a real interest in an idea that the glass, and what doesn't show in these drawings is the way I tried to detail it in a way that the mullions would even be coplanar with the glass, to minimize anything that would be perpendicular to the glass. Next slide. And this is looking from one space, from what might be the office space across to the arboretum, looking down the arboretum to a door that would take you back out into the courtyard. Next slide. The model is done in masonite and plexiglass. Plexiglass is hard to photograph, but as I tried to actually use it in ways that I thought would get some of the effect that I really hoped a building could have on this site. If you go up and down Louisiana Avenue, they actually noticed that Houston is full of a lot of these very beautiful, even actually the inexpensive sort of later model sort of plate glass windows. Not so much the sort of anodized aluminum deep frame, sort of muscular ones, but there's quite an assortment of very beautiful, rather flat, planar glass windows along these streets. In this situation, I was very interested in this idea of pushing this plate right up to the edge and letting the sort of reflectivity of it sort of deal with this nebulous figure ground condition of building in this area. Next slide. And next slide. What's not fully developed yet is an idea that has to do with painting the wall surfaces in a sort of latex paint, not all the way to their perimeters, but held back in a kind of geometric way from the edges that you might actually start to think of the paint, even in the extent to which it might start to peel in the way latex paint can peel in a rubbery fashion, that you would feel it as a sort of membrane laid upon, and that the opacity of it as a white sort of Malevich square would sort of end any idea of thinking about perspectival depth and might induce readings instead of moving along and beside planes rather than arranging yourself in front of behind them. Next slide. That's the view of that. Next slide. Next. The curtain wall, and I don't have a simple way to express this yet. I should have diagrams if I really wanted it to be understood, I suppose. But it starts here. It doesn't connect to the other building. Moves along, encloses that space when it coincides with this volume, but then turns south and sort of starts to head out of on its own accord and begin to configure an idea about the street space. The people on the sidewalk at that point would be having the same relation to the curtain wall that you do. Even though there's very few of them. And then it dead ends, and then you get a sort of transformation of the vector that it reads this way in a somewhat violent fashion. The arboretum, you would enter from the front building, pass through a small door, survey this space. It wasn't until you get to the end of it that you would actually get a view to the left or to the right, where you would sense actually that there was a building next door to you that was entirely open along this surface, which we're not getting a slide of, where they might be looking back if this was not enclosed. Next slide. Next slide. I live very close to Philip Johnson's St. Thomas, which has a sort of an amazing use of glass and iron in the window details. They recently added to it and tried to replicate it, but they used aluminum and anodized it black, and it simply doesn't have the same effect of an idea of an iron window frame and a window. At this point in the rear courtyard, I actually went so far as to speculate, and I've been interested in this for a while, in the idea that actually it would apply the glass an inch or so from the surface of the concrete. Obviously it would collect dirt and things behind it, but sort of still an interest in sort of restating the surface in a way that still denies its depth by setting up something that traditionally would include depth. Next slide. Next slide. Some collage drawings that were trying to portray some of the thoughts. In this sort of reading of duration that I was at least only beginning to understand and trying to work with, for me the interest moves towards not so much thinking about how things look, but actually how they operate or what they're made of. The collages, which sort of employ and borrow images, Michelangelo's Bacchus, Robert Frank's recent photographies of ice, a rock formation from a mountain range, what shouldn't be there, an organic being, a caterpillar, and Philip Johnson reading behind his reflective glass, but still being seen behind it as well. The collage in the glass on the top is a molecular structure of a crystal, of one crystal, type of crystal. And in this other elevation, actually, the torsion surface from Turani's Palazzo Littorio is stretched in Photoshop and used here to sort of simulate an idea of that slight wafting and buckling that occurs along a surface. What's behind both of these collages is the sort of silver tape that you use to mark out slides. And although I can't really express it in any clear way, the sort of the diagonal configuration of it for me is meaning to depict just how brittle the entire construction could be and how it actually might rack, or the sense of the imminence of it racking. Next slide. Study model. Next slide. In the spring, I'm putting up a show at Berkeley at the University Art Museum, and what I've been invited to do, and what that last house was hoping to deal with, was to respond to a group of Hans Hoffman paintings. The museum has a collection of 49 paintings, and they said I could select a number of them and position my work either in relation to, against, or even produce a work that would relate to it. What I was interested in doing was not so much mimicking painting or even explicitly using a painting to make a building, but to set up a simple sort of suggestion that architecture might be able to induce a sort of transformed visuality or an idea of duration that might allow us to sort of reconfigure how we cohere ideas of time and our position within a contemporary city, which is largely, at least in the case of Houston, obviously, in Los Angeles, not built on optic speculation, but on financial and land speculation. Next 2 slides. I'd like to end with a brief project. 2 years ago, Japan Architect, in their annual Shinkin-Chiku-sha residential housing competition, Rem Koolhaas wrote the brief, and it asked the architects who submitted entries to design a house with no style. I designed a house that I thought had a lot of style, had too much style, was a style I was sort of tired of working on, and was ready to give up. But then I recently had gotten Quark Express and a new computer and started working on developing what might be a site plan for that house. And as I developed the site plan, I actually began to understand what maybe these ideas of a house, what a house might be able to imply about a city. The story is very simple, and I wrote a story simultaneously to it. It says, "Did you ever dream that you awoke to find yourself the only person left on the planet? In my dream, everyone is still here, but they've all gone inside. Of course, I didn't realize this at first, but after I did, I tried to find out if and when they were coming back out. Soon I gave up guessing and got used to the idea that people were something like a mirror, and without them I couldn't see a point in shaving or even getting dressed. Since everyone else was inside to stay, I started feeling at home everywhere. My house lost its centric pull, and I started sleeping wherever I wanted. I once put my bed out on the street and slept without covers. Another time I put my bed on a very steeply curved freeway exit ramp near where I had almost once rear-ended another car because I came upon it too quickly. My house seemed like it had been turned inside out, and I felt like I was everywhere all at once. Usually, though, I just slept at home in the bedroom with the windows locked and the drapes pulled and the door locked. I guess it was just for old time's sake, but it made the room seem like any point anywhere. At night, I would go to sleep trying to hold that thought while simultaneously thinking of all of the others in their rooms and the continuous spaces between us." And I think would leave, if you want to leave it up for a second, I'll read the rest. The story moved in several levels. One was narrative, they're all narrative, obviously, but the one that made some are more dry. During the topological revolution of 1993, my house was turned inside out. My neighbors' houses resisted, but thick green shrubs sprouted and belted them all inside till the physicists could figure out what had happened. I called my neighbor on the phone, and he told me that we were about to enter the realm of true modernity, but until then we would have to be content to speak on the phone. No one else was coming out past their shrubs. My house didn't have a shrub, so I went out to see what it was like out there. And on the other side, realizing as the story developed that it was a bit of a true story, I created a narrative of Mies and Stephen Hawking circling this artifact of a house that had emerged from sort of some physics gone array, thinking about it spatially and being chased by a social worker, trying to tell them that economic topology had made this a true story for many people. Next slides. Next slides. I won't go through these, but the extent to what I'm working on sort of comes down to a very simple distinction between being interested in a sort of rupture of a perspectival basin as a dihedral relationship and a rupture of a gravitational basin in a coplanar surface relationship. As someone who designs, like everyone here, I suppose, I think I use design like most of us do to actually just start to understand ideas, not just about what we think, but ideas about the city, ideas about other architects. And for me, this work has always been sort of a method of probing, and if I could, I would certainly show how what it's led to in terms of thoughts of Le Corbusier, Raphael Maneo, Louis Kahn. It definitely is not so much simply about itself, but it's a method of learning, and learning about other architectures as well. Next slide. Just end with a very brief story. After a year and a half in Houston, which I flew to when I moved there, I decided I should try to drive back to California to get a better grip on where I was. I thought I might drive through some cities, but really I ended up driving on freeways and seeing mostly sort of megalopolis sprawls around Phoenix or Tucson. Side trips to other places did actually sort of produce some pretty amazing results. But we came out here to actually look at a place called California City. And I had research from a friend of mine on a city that was planned to be instantly developed right at the edge of the Mojave Desert out near Edwards Air Force Base in the 60s. And there was a sort of a master plan intact that was a bit like a little Brasilia, very miniature Brasilia, but something like a Brasilia in scale. So we wanted to see California City to see what had happened to it in 30 years. Next slides. As we got towards it, I had the impression that the planning would have given up, and that California City was probably going to be something like Palmdale or some other sprawl edge city. And as we got closer, it's about 2 hours outside of LA, we saw hints of what we thought it might be, although we hoped to see this planned community in the center and maybe a piece of it. Next slide. We did get closer, and I won't show you the slides of it, but we did find a tiny piece of the planned city. But to the north of the planned city, we found the Walmarts and the sprawl. And to the south, where the city was supposed to be, this is what we found. Next slides. California City didn't go the way it was supposed to go. The money took it another direction, and the original plan for the city was essentially erased, although slightly inscribed on the surface of the desert. Next slide. As we looked closer for a lot that we were actually hoping to find and thought would be covered by suburban houses by now, we found roads that looked like this. Next slide. And we finally actually found a site. And the site, this area is entirely subdivided. The money went the other way, the city went the other way, and what had been hoped to be a research project actually sort of went the other way itself when we found out that the small piece of planned community that did hold up a bit had recently been voted down in terms of tax support, and that the 3-car garages and the satellite dishes and the Walmarts had fully won out, even to the extent where no one was willing to spend anything on the public realm anymore. My question with the work I think I've depicted tonight really has to do with wondering, as some architect trying to conceive of a practice in America, how do you build in places like this? I understand the massive growth that's going on in Asia, and most of my colleagues actually are starting to become involved in it. But at the same time, it seems to me a very difficult question to think about these spaces as well. And obviously, I know SCI-Arc is very involved in that. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate being here. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions if that's the regular format. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, it seems perspective is very important. It's very important. It's very important, and it seems to be to take perspective as something to the subject object.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you're right. Most of them actually, the subject is standing where the camera is standing. And for me, one of the things that encouraged me to move away from those first buildings was the idea that they told you where to stand. They dealt with frontality in the traditional sense of the word. Mill owners building any number of sort of Brise Soleil projects by Le Corbusier, where the ramp sort of posits the feet and induces the eye. If there were buildings, there'd be hopefully a lot more shots than the camera can allow. But you're right. I mean, the idea is really finally that I mean, the metaphor, it's a silly metaphor, but to me it's useful. It's if you get a car stuck in a snow ditch in the winter back east, and you start to rock it out of that ditch, eventually the car sort of rocks out over the ditch and you start to sort of spin around a little bit and finally take off. For me, the idea is in those early projects was to sort of rock the eye out of its basin. Eventually, it might start to wobble a bit and not find its way, and eventually I think it would really become opaque, and that you would start to have to sort of think architecture rather than look at it. So the perspective is there, but it's hopefully there to be overcome. I wouldn't say I've particularly done it. I'm saying that's what I was struggling to do in a primal way. I was supposed to repeat the questions, I realized, so they could be recorded, but we won't. Anybody else? Marianne.
I'm just curious about the Torsion building that we didn't know so well, and what its program was and where it was.
Oh, it's in Milano. It's called Casa Rustici. It's an apartment house, and it's a series of flats arranged. It's actually two buildings connected by a bridge. But what I wouldn't have portrayed Torani as fully being interested in that concept, but it's too bad that I didn't show more Torani, but if you look across his career in a sort of cursory glance, you find continually this sort of interest in the peripheral versus central depth, sometimes brought to a very clear formal resolution, and other times, must have obviously compromised by something else in the, along the course of building. But it does seem to be a definite preoccupation. Anyone else? Thank you very much.